Time now for today's perspective. Violence and racism in the country's police force has brought tens of thousands of people onto the streets in protest in recent weeks. While accusations have been made on multiple occasions in the past, last week the video showing a black man being beaten in his own studio, coupled with a new law that aimed to reduce the publication of videos of police officers, has brought new attention to the problem. Well, we're joined by a Franco-Senegalese professor of French and Francophone studies in Pennsylvania, Ms. Mame-Fatou Niang. Ms. Niang, thanks so much for your time. Can I start by asking you this latest scenes of police violence here in France? What's your reaction to it?
No reaction. Unfortunately, this is not a novelty for me. These images are not a novelty for me, although they seem to be pretty shocking and surprising for many people in France, who seem to have just discovered that police violence was a reality, dating back 2 years ago with the Gilets jaunes crisis, the yellow vest crisis, and just discovering it because for the first time, this violence was being exerted on white bodies, and it was happening, in places like Paris, downtown Bordeaux, downtown Lyon, and anybody who's familiar with the banlieues, those places outside the outskirts of France's big cities, know that this violence had been exerted on black and brown bodies for decades, if not centuries, if we take into account our colonial and slavery history.
Indeed.
So I'm not surprised.
Give us an idea, because it does feel like perhaps because it's come to the centre of Paris, a new focus and a belief, if you like, that the police are violent and racist, and yet the political body in France continue to deny it, saying it's not at all systematic in the system.
Absolutely. I'm invited in debates where the question is the police racist? I mean, we are living in a country, France, which modernity was created at our capitalism. Our society was built on the slave trade. I mean, what else do we need? We built our society on race. Then we decided in the 20th century as a society that race brought us two of the biggest catastrophe of modern time, the Holocaust and slavery, the slave trade, and that as a society, republicanism, universalism was going to be, take down that monster that is racism. And how did we do that in France? By deciding to remove officially the word race from all our official documents. Ta-da! Well, guys, removing the word race, or trying, because it has not been completely erased from all official documents, does not remove racism from society. And we inherited from those 400 years of colonialism and slavery a host of representation of what is me, how do we create national identity, what it is to be French, what is an us, and as a corollary to that us, there is also a them, the other, and that other oftentimes is black and brown. And we live in a society that is racist, and I don't understand how our institutions, especially the police, can be, immune to that racism. So I'm very, surprised that people are discovering that there's been a systematic history, and just going back up in the history of the French police. The French police, I mean, I'm giving these examples, talking a lot about this in my classes. 1777, the king created what is called la police des noirs, because it was forbidden. Planters living in the Caribbeans was strongly discouraged to bring their black slaves or mulattoes on the metropole, on the hexagon, on mainland France, because then they had to be freed. So a police, what is called the police des noirs, the police of the blacks, was specially created to lock them up or look after what was called the runaway freeze on the mainland. And you just have all these instances in our history from the 19th century to the 20th century with those names that are not really famous in our history. The Fouché, Belote, a colonial administrator who was, created bloodshed in Indochina, in Algeria, who was behind the massacre of workers and students in 1967, May 1967 in Guadeloupe. And because of, how strict he was invited to create this colonial brigade in the north of France, in a place called Saint-Saint-Denis, that happened to have a high concentration of black and brown French. And he was asked to create this special unit that is called La BAC. And because the BAC originated from colonial troops, and the BAC is always today notorious for, the racism that permeates its actions, especially in those places called the banlieue, the outskirts of France's big city that have an overwhelming Afro-French, Arab French, Maghrebi French population, and Muslim French population. So yeah, there's a history.
Exactly. It sounds like a lot of the work that needs to be done is, looking at that history and acknowledging that history to a certain extent. We've talked about racism in the systems in France, but what about society? Is there still a reluctance among people in general to talk about the issue of race?
I mean, absolutely. I'm called one of the most racist person in France because my research is on race, because universalism says that there is only one identity. It's Frenchness. And Frenchness is une indivisible. It's one and indivisible. It cannot be hyphenated with ethnicity, with religion, with anything. And to try to bring back race, the ghost of race, is to really try to sow division in a society that has figured it all. And everything in our society, from proofs of racial that we have issues in the way black and brown bodies are being treated in our hospitals, to discrimination in housing, everything here on the terrain is here to kind of contradict this universal myth. And today, as a researcher, but also as a citizen, my question is simple. We are living in a myth. We're living in a universalist myth. And we need, as a society, if we really want to be one, to confront our history. Because also one of the part that our French identity was created, I'm quoting here the words of French historian Renan, was that we have to be cautious about what we remember about our past. National identity is built as much on as what we remember collectively of our past as we choose to forget. And we have to be cautious not to remember everything, because unity was never done without violence. And basically what happened is that in our history, in French history, a lot of the reason that explains my presence in this country as a Black person has been forgotten. We are French because we built it, we had a great and glorious past together, right? And from that past, we found the energy to be one today and spring toward a better future. But if people have no idea how I contributed, how my ancestors contributed to this country, right? How can they feel like they can be one with me, and how can they lose this sense of always seeing me as a foreigner, always seeing me as a danger to this community, always seeing me as someone who can only speak to show gratitude and cannot really fully participate in this society as a full citizen, because you're never really fully seen as being part of this, because our history, our common history, has been forgotten.
Okay, so a massive issue when it comes to education. You're a lecturer of French studies, so I'm wondering, is there also something when it comes to the French language and what needs to be addressed there?
Absolutely. I mean, in my research, I addressed how central creating our language was in creating this sense of national identity, right? We didn't want too much of Latin because it's a colonizer language, but our Gaulois, although we are very proud of our Gaulois heritage, it was a rough language, right? So we came with this means to mold a language that will show pride, that will show, just how everything that we want to echo and mirror about classness and intelligence. That's what French language is. And in the way, for example, after the revolution, the brutal dispersion, when we think of what happened during the terror and after the terror, things like Abbé Grégoire, and the way that local dialects were annihilated, because to speak French was to be French. So the language is extremely important. And today, the silences of history echoes in our language. If I tell you that we don't have a word to talk about say blackness. There is no word to say blackness. And we have one of the richest language around. We have an Académie Française. We have multiple nuances for one word, but we don't have a word for blackness. We don't have many words to talk about race, because we've decided, and we know that if a word doesn't exist in French, it does not exist in our collective psyche. So absolutely, the language, saying, and it's not about inventing, it's not about creating, it's about unveiling and giving more place to create a more common and more, whole story. I'm sorry.
Miss Mame-Fatou Niang, it's fascinating. I wish we had more time to talk, but thank you so much for your time and staying up to talk to us here on France 24 and bring us your perspective.